one night with two Apache sisters, and the rancher was forever marked by their secret. John Harper had always been a man of routine. His days began long before sunrise, with the soft creak of the wooden barn doors and the low hum of cattle moving in the pens. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly around him, a mix of dry plains, rocky outcrops, and the occasional scrubby bush that seemed to cling to life despite the harsh sun. Most people in town thought he was a little odd, living alone on such a remote ranch, but John didn't mind. He liked the quiet. It gave him time to think, to breathe, and to care for the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. That summer had been hotter than usual. The air shimmered with heat during the day, and the nights, though cooler, offered little relief. One evening, as John was checking the water troughs for the cattle, dark clouds began rolling over the horizon. At first, they were nothing more than a distant smudge in the sky, but soon the wind picked up, carrying with it a fine layer of dust that stung the skin. He knew a storm was coming. By the time he reached the cabin, the first drops of rain were falling. John shut the doors and windows tightly and set about preparing for the storm. He lit a fire in the old stone fireplace and listened to the wind whistling around the edges of the roof. He was just pouring himself a cup of coffee when a soft knock came at the door. John frowned. He rarely had visitors, especially at this hour. He opened the door to see 2 young women standing there, their clothes dusted with sand and their hair damp from the sudden drizzle. They looked worn out, but their eyes were alert, scanning the small cabin as if deciding whether it was safe. "Can I help you?" John asked cautiously, keeping one hand on the door. The taller of the 2 spoke first. "Please, can we stay for a while? There's a storm coming, and we have nowhere else to go." Her voice was calm but carried an undertone of urgency. John studied them for a moment. There was something different about these women, a strength that didn't come from their size but from the way they held themselves. Despite his usual caution, he nodded. "All right. Come in. You can wait here until the storm passes." They stepped inside quickly, brushing the dust from their clothes. John noticed that they carried nothing with them except small bundles tied with cloth. They didn't speak much at first, only exchanging quiet glances with each other as if sharing an unspoken understanding. He guided them to the small living area near the fire and offered them some blankets. "I'm John Harper," he said, trying to ease the tension. "You'll be safe here until the storm ends. I'm Ayana, and this is my sister Nayeli," the taller one replied. "Thank you for letting us stay." John nodded and returned to his duties, fetching water and ensuring the fire was strong enough to keep them warm. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the rain turned into a relentless downpour. The storm seemed to last forever, and with each passing hour, the cabin became a small sanctuary against the chaos of the desert night. As the hours went by, John found himself observing the sisters more closely. They moved with quiet confidence, arranging themselves near the fire and speaking in soft, low tones that were almost musical. It was clear that they had faced hardships before, hardships that had taught them to be careful, to rely on each other, and to keep secrets. John, who was used to living in solitude, found himself intrigued by their presence. Over the next few hours, conversation started to flow. John asked where they were from and why they were traveling through the desert alone. The sisters were cautious at first, giving only fragments of their story. They had come from a small Apache community, traveling to a relative's home in another town. The journey had been longer and more dangerous than they had anticipated, and the storm had forced them to seek shelter. Despite the brevity of their explanation, John felt a connection forming. There was something about their calm resilience, the way they handled the storm without panic, that reminded him of the people in his own family who had built this ranch from nothing. He offered them a simple meal, bread, stew, and coffee, and watched as they accepted it gratefully. their movements precise and deliberate. It was clear they were used to taking care of themselves, but they appreciated kindness when it was offered. As the night deepened, the storm outside became fiercer. The wind rattled the windows, and the rain pounded against the roof. John could hear the occasional roar of thunder, followed by a flash of lightning that illuminated the small cabin in stark white light. The sisters didn't seem afraid. Instead, they sat near the fire, quietly talking to each other in whispers. John caught fragments of their conversation, mentions of family, of lands far away, of people who had wronged them, but he didn't press. He understood that some stories couldn't be forced. At one point, Nayeli looked directly at John and smiled faintly. "You have a good heart, John Harper," she said. "Not many would let strangers into their home during a storm." John shrugged, feeling slightly embarrassed by the compliment. "I don't like leaving anyone out in the desert when it's dangerous. It's the right thing to do." For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the storm and the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. John found that the presence of the sisters, though unexpected, brought a sense of warmth and life to the cabin. He realized that even in a life built on solitude, moments like this could leave a lasting impression. When the storm finally began to ease in the early hours of the morning, John noticed that the sisters were preparing to leave. He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a mix of curiosity and a sense of loss. They had been only guests for a single night, but their presence had changed the atmosphere of his home in a way that he hadn't expected. "Are you going to be all right on your journey?" he asked as he opened the door to let them step outside. The desert had cooled under the storm's passing, and the first rays of the sun were beginning to pierce through the clouds. "Yes," Ayana replied, her voice steady. "Because of your kindness, we'll make it." They left quietly, carrying their bundles, leaving John standing at the cabin door, watching them disappear into the morning light. For the rest of the day, he couldn't shake the memory of their presence. There was a calm strength about the sisters that lingered in his mind, a reminder that some encounters, even brief ones, could leave a mark on a person's life forever. And in that moment, John Harper realized that the desert, vast and empty as it seemed, could sometimes bring the most unexpected of visitors, and with them, stories that might one day change him in ways he hadn't imagined. After that night, John Harper found it hard to focus on his daily chores. He went about his usual routines, feeding the cattle, repairing fences, and checking the water troughs, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the two sisters. Ayana and Nayeli had left at sunrise, disappearing into the vast desert as if they had never been there. And yet their presence lingered in John's mind like a faint echo he could not shake. The following days were unusually quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air fresh and crisp. The sky was a clear, bright blue, and the sun reflected off the rocky hills in a dazzling display. But John felt a subtle unease. Something about the sisters' visit had changed the way he viewed the world around him. He began noticing details he had overlooked for years: the patterns in the wind-blown sand, the tracks of animals in the dry riverbed, and the distant smoke from a campfire that might signal travelers. One afternoon, as he repaired a section of fence near the northern edge of his property, he heard voices in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a group of cowboys or workers from a nearby ranch, but the voices had a softer, melodic tone, almost like a conversation carried on the wind. Curious, he paused and listened carefully. It was unmistakable. There were two voices, speaking quietly to each other, yet with an urgency that drew his attention. John walked cautiously toward the sound, moving over the rocky terrain and keeping the sun at his back so he wouldn't cast a shadow. As he crested a small hill, he saw them. It was Ayana and Nayeli. They had returned, walking slowly along the edge of his land. They had packed lightly, carrying the same small bundles as before. Their faces lit up when they saw him, and they waved with a combination of relief and recognition. "What are you doing here?" John called out, his voice carrying across the dry ground. Ayanna smiled, approaching him carefully. "We needed to come back," she said softly. "There is something we must discuss with you. Something important." John nodded, motioning for them to follow him to the cabin. He sensed that this was not just a casual visit. The sisters' expression carried a weight, a story they were ready to share. Inside, he set another pot of coffee on the stove and gestured for them to sit near the fire. The atmosphere was different this time. There was no storm, no urgency of survival, but an unmistakable tension. Finally, Nayeli spoke. "John, we didn't tell you everything last night because we were not ready, but we have to trust someone with our secret, and we trust you." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the seriousness of what she was about to say. John leaned forward, careful not to interrupt. "I'll listen," he said simply. "Tell me whatever you feel you can." Ayanna took a deep breath. "Our family, it has been through a lot. A long time ago, something valuable was taken from us. An heirloom, a piece of our history, was stolen. It belonged to our ancestors, passed down for generations. Losing it caused pain and division in our family. We've been searching for it ever since, but it hasn't been easy. People don't understand the value of what was lost. They see it as an object, but for us, it carries memory, culture, and identity." John listened silently, letting their words sink in. He had always known that life in the desert could be hard, and that families often carried the weight of history. But this story felt different. It was personal, a wound that had lasted through years and generations. Nayeli continued, her hands wrapped around the warm mug of coffee. "We were on our way to another town, hoping to find a clue about where it went. But we faced dangers along the way. People who wanted to keep us from learning the truth. We came to your cabin because we needed shelter and safety, and now we need help. We can't do this alone." John felt a strong sense of responsibility. He had always considered himself a man of the land, someone who protected his home and those in need. But he had never imagined becoming involved in a mystery like this. Yet, looking at the sisters, he knew he couldn't turn them away. They trusted him, and he had an instinctive understanding that their mission was just and important. "You have my help," John said firmly. "I don't know everything yet, but I'll stand by you. We'll figure this out together." Ayanna and Nayeli exchanged a quick glance, relief softening their faces. "Thank you, John," Ayanna said. "You don't know how much this means to us. We didn't come here looking for help, but finding someone we could trust. It changes everything." Over the next few days, John learned more about the sisters' past. Their family had lived in a small Apache community near the mountains. The stolen heirloom was a carved wooden box, decorated with symbols that represented generations of their ancestors. It had been taken by outsiders decades ago and had passed through several hands. The sisters' parents had searched for it all their lives but never succeeded. Now the sisters had taken up the mission themselves, determined to restore what had been lost. John offered them practical support. He knew the terrain, the hidden paths, and the places where travelers could rest safely. He helped them plan the next steps, suggesting routes and strategies to avoid potential dangers. But he also realized that the journey would not be easy. The desert could be unforgiving, and the people who had taken the heirloom might still pose a threat. Despite the seriousness of the situation, John found moments of calm with the sisters. They shared stories of their childhood, the customs of their community, and small details about their lives that helped John understand them better. It was clear that their journey was about more than recovering an object. It was about reclaiming a part of themselves and preserving their heritage. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, the three of them sat near the fire outside the cabin. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the desert seemed almost peaceful. Ayanna spoke quietly, "John, you should know, what we're doing is not just about the past. Some people will try to stop us. Some may not understand why it matters. We might face hostility, even danger." John nodded. "I understand. I've lived here long enough to know that not everyone respects history or heritage. But I also know that courage isn't about avoiding danger. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind rustling through the sagebrush. John realized that the sisters' determination was contagious. Their mission had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It was more than curiosity now. It was a commitment to help them succeed, no matter the obstacles. As night fell, the stars emerged in the clear desert sky. The Milky Way stretched across the horizon, and the air was cool against their skin. John felt a quiet connection to the sisters, a trust that had formed quickly but felt unbreakable. He knew that the coming days would test them all, but for the first time he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. By the next morning, John and the sisters had made plans to begin their search. They would start by visiting old friends of the family, places where the heirloom might have passed, and anyone who might know of its current location. It was a cautious plan, one that required patience, observation, and a willingness to face the unknown. Before they left, Ayanna turned to John and said, "We couldn't have done this without you. Thank you for believing in us, even when you didn't know the whole story." John smiled, a mixture of pride and determination filling him. "We'll find it together. And when we do, it won't just be an object we recover. It will be a story restored and a family healed." As they set out across the desert, John felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The journey ahead was uncertain, but he also knew that some experiences were worth the risk. That night in his cabin had changed everything. What had started as a simple act of kindness had evolved into a shared mission, and John Harper could feel, deep in his bones, that this was the beginning of something that would leave a lasting mark on all their lives. The desert was quiet that morning, but John Harper could feel a subtle tension in the air. He had spent years learning to read the land, how the wind shifted, how the animals moved, how the sun reflected off the rocks, but even he sensed that the journey ahead with Ayanna and Nayeli would test him in ways he had never experienced. The sisters had spent most of their lives searching for the heirloom that belonged to their family, and now that John was part of their mission, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. They packed their supplies carefully. The sisters had learned to travel light, carrying only what was necessary: a few changes of clothes, water skins, some dried food, and a small notebook where Ayanna kept notes about places they had visited and leads they had followed. John, on the other hand, carried more practical tools for the land: rope, a small first aid kit, maps, and his rifle for protection against wild animals. Though he had never intended to use it for harm, it was a part of his life in the desert, and he knew that the terrain could be unforgiving. As they set out, the sun rose high over the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. The sisters walked with quiet confidence, their steps light but purposeful, while John followed closely, observing the land for signs of recent travelers, abandoned camps, or anything that might give them a clue about the heirloom's location. The desert was alive with subtle hints: a broken branch here, a footprint there, a trail of scattered stones. John felt a renewed sense of purpose, realizing that these small details could make all the difference. Hours passed with minimal conversation. Each of them was lost in thought. John thought about the responsibility he had taken on. He had always protected his land and his cattle, But protecting a family's legacy was a different kind of challenge. Ayana and Nayeli were focused, scanning the horizon, occasionally pointing out features in the land that reminded them of their stories. They spoke occasionally of their childhood, of moments when their parents had taught them lessons about resilience, patience, and the importance of family history. By mid-afternoon, they reached the first stop on their journey, a small town on the edge of the desert, known to have a few older residents who might remember the heirloom or those connected to it. The town was quiet and dusty, with streets lined with low wooden buildings and a few scattered stores. John parked near the edge of town and suggested they split up briefly to gather information. The sisters moved with a graceful confidence, blending into the environment while asking discreet questions. It became clear quickly that some of the townspeople were hesitant to speak. The heirloom had passed through many hands over the years, and some residents preferred not to discuss matters that could bring trouble. John stayed nearby, listening carefully, watching for any sign of danger or unusual activity. Despite the initial hesitation of the townspeople, the sisters' patience and respect gradually drew people into conversation. A few older residents recalled fragments, stories of a wooden box that had changed hands several times, of people who had left town mysteriously, or of items being hidden for safekeeping. Each clue was small, but together they formed a pattern that slowly began to make sense. By late afternoon, John, Aina, and Nayeli had compiled a list of possible leads. Some were promising, while others seemed like dead ends. They decided to stay overnight in the town at a small, quiet inn. The sisters were grateful for the comfort, but they spent most of the evening reviewing the notes they had taken and discussing their next steps. John helped them organize the information logically, offering insight into human behavior and practical strategies for following up leads. That night, as John lay on the cot in the corner of the inn's room, he reflected on the journey so far. It had been a simple act of kindness at his cabin that had led to this moment. He had expected a quiet life on his ranch, a life where each day followed a predictable pattern. Yet now, he was part of a mission that was uncertain, challenging, and deeply meaningful. He felt a quiet admiration for the sisters' courage, for the way they had carried the weight of their family's loss for so many years without giving up. The next morning, they set out again, following the leads from the town. One clue pointed to a neighboring valley where an old craftsman had once lived, a man reputed to have a connection to several valuable objects in the region. The journey there was longer than expected, taking them through narrow canyons, across dry riverbeds, and over rocky hills that tested John's endurance and the sisters' determination. Each step brought new challenges: loose rocks that threatened to trip them, sudden gusts of wind carrying dust that stung their eyes, and the relentless sun beating down from above. By mid-afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the valley, where the old craftsman had once lived. The cabin was now abandoned, the walls weathered and crumbling, and the roof partially collapsed. Yet, John noticed signs that someone had been there recently: footprints in the sand, a few scattered tools, and a faint trail leading away from the cabin. Ayana and Nayeli moved quietly, scanning the surroundings for clues, their expressions focused and intense. "Someone has been here recently," Ayana whispered. "We need to follow the trail carefully. It could lead us closer to the heirloom." John nodded, leading the way along the narrow path. The trail wound through rocky outcrops and shallow gullies, disappearing at times only to reappear further ahead. They moved slowly, cautiously, knowing that haste could cause them to miss vital details. As the afternoon turned into evening, they found an old weathered chest partially buried under a pile of stones. It was empty, but inside was a note written in faded ink, hinting at the next location where the heirloom might be hidden. The sisters examined the note carefully, their faces lighting up with recognition. "This is a lead," Nayeli said. It's the first clear clue we've had in years. We're getting closer." John felt a surge of determination. He realized that their mission was not just about recovering an object, it was about reclaiming history, restoring a family's pride, and honoring the legacy of generations past. The weight of responsibility he had felt at the beginning of the journey now felt purposeful and meaningful. That night, they camped near the edge of the valley under the vast desert sky. The stars were bright and numerous, casting a gentle glow over the rugged landscape. They built a small fire, and John watched the sisters as they spoke quietly of their memories, their family, and their hopes. He realized that courage was not just about facing physical challenges, it was also about confronting the pain of the past and striving to restore what had been lost. As they prepared for the next day's journey, John felt a sense of quiet confidence. The desert was still full of unknowns, but they had made progress. The sisters had shown him the meaning of resilience and dedication, and he had learned the importance of trust and patience. Together, they were beginning to uncover the threads of a story that had been hidden for years, and each step brought them closer to their goal. Even though the path ahead was uncertain, John knew that they would face it together, and in that moment, as the desert night surrounded them, he felt a deep connection not only to the sisters but to the land itself, a bond forged through shared purpose, courage, and the determination to do what was right, no matter how difficult the journey might become. The next morning, John Harper, Ayanna, and Nayeli woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the desert haze. The previous day's discovery had given them hope, but John knew that the hardest part of the journey was yet to come. The note they had found pointed to a hidden location deep in a canyon known for its difficult terrain. Many travelers avoided it entirely because of the steep cliffs, loose rocks, and narrow pathways. Yet, for the sisters, this was their chance to uncover the heirloom that had been missing from their family for generations. They packed their supplies carefully, checking water skins, food, and ropes, knowing that the canyon's challenges would test their endurance. John led the way, moving with deliberate steps, while the sisters followed closely, their eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of danger or guidance. The canyon loomed ahead like a great, silent barrier. Its walls rose sharply, casting long shadows over the rocky floor below. The first part of the descent was manageable, but as they moved further into the canyon, the path became narrower and more treacherous. Loose stones shifted under their feet, and John had to pause frequently to help the sisters navigate tricky stretches. Despite the physical strain, they pressed on, motivated by the hope that they were getting closer to the heirloom. Each step brought a mix of excitement and tension. As they rounded a bend, they came across evidence that someone else had been in the canyon recently. Footprints in the soft sand led toward a small cave, and scraps of paper fluttered near the entrance, likely carried by the wind. Ayanna examined the footprints carefully, her eyes narrowing. "These are fresh," she said quietly. "Someone else is searching for the heirloom. We need to be careful." John nodded, feeling a mixture of concern and determination. He had always known that the desert could be unpredictable, but now he understood that the stakes were higher than he had imagined. The sisters' mission was not just a personal journey. It was a race against time and the unknown. They approached the cave cautiously, moving in a single line with John at the front. Inside, the air was cool and slightly damp, a stark contrast to the heat outside. Shadows danced along the walls as they stepped deeper into the darkness. The cave widened into a small chamber, and in the center, partially hidden beneath a pile of rocks, was an old wooden chest. Its surface was weathered and covered in dust, but the intricate carvings were unmistakable, the same symbols Ayanna had described from her family stories. Ayanna and Nayeli exchanged a glance filled with both relief and awe. "This is it," Nayeli whispered. After all these years, we've found it. John stepped forward, carefully removing the stones that covered the chest. His hands were steady, but his heart raced with anticipation. The sisters knelt beside the chest, brushing away dust and debris, revealing the carved patterns in greater detail. The box was heavier than it looked, and it carried a faint scent of aged wood and history. As they opened the chest, they found the heirloom inside, intact and carefully preserved. Ayanna lifted it gently, her hands trembling slightly. Tears welled up in her eyes as she held the wooden box close. Nayeli reached out, touching the carvings with reverence. "It's real," she said softly. "After all these years, it's real." John watched them with a mixture of admiration and humility. He had helped them reach this moment, but the emotional weight of the discovery belonged to the sisters. For generations, their family had carried the pain of losing something so precious, and now, in this quiet canyon, they had reclaimed it. But the moment of triumph was not without its challenges. As they carefully prepared to leave the cave, they heard the faint sound of voices outside. Someone else had discovered their presence, and John realized that they were not alone in the canyon. He motioned for the sisters to stay low, and they crouched behind a rock, hearts pounding. The voices grew closer, and John could see shadows moving across the canyon walls. It was clear that the others were searching for the same chest, driven by motives that were unknown but likely less honorable than the sisters. John's instincts as a protector took over. He signaled for Ayanna and Nayeli to remain calm and stay quiet. They held their breath, listening to the footsteps and the faint rustling of clothing. After several tense minutes, the intruders passed by the cave entrance, unaware of the three figures hiding inside. John waited until the sound of their footsteps faded before allowing the sisters to stand. Their hands still gripped the heirloom, but their expressions were filled with determination rather than fear. They knew that the journey was not over, but they had survived the most immediate threat. As they made their way out of the canyon, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the rugged landscape. The physical challenges of the canyon had tested their strength, endurance, and courage, but the emotional and mental challenges had been just as significant. John reflected on the journey so far: the storms, the desert heat, the abandoned cabins, and the hidden trails, and realized that the experience had changed all of them. By the time they reached a safe spot to camp for the night, the sisters were exhausted but filled with a quiet joy. The heirloom rested safely in Ayanna's pack, and their bond with John had grown stronger through shared trials and mutual trust. They built a small fire, and as the flames danced in the night, they shared stories of their ancestors, of the lessons passed down through generations, and of the importance of preserving history and family legacy. John felt a deep sense of pride and respect for the sisters. Their courage, patience, and determination had carried them through the most difficult part of the journey. He also recognized the personal growth he had experienced, learning the value of trust, the importance of patience, and the strength that comes from standing together in the face of uncertainty. The night in the desert was quiet, filled only with the sounds of the wind through the rocks and the occasional call of distant wildlife. John, Ayanna, and Nayeli sat near the fire, reflecting on the day's events and planning the next steps. They knew that while they had found the heirloom, there were still challenges ahead: returning it safely, ensuring it remained protected, and sharing their story with those who could appreciate its true value. Before they went to sleep, Ayanna looked at John with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you," she said softly. "You believed in us when no one else would. You gave us the strength to keep going." John smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "You didn't need me to believe," he replied. "You believed in yourselves. I just walked alongside you." As they drifted off to sleep under the vast desert sky, the stars shining brightly above, John realized that this journey had been about more than just finding an heirloom. It had been about courage, trust, resilience, and the power of working together toward a shared goal. The canyon had tested them in ways they had never expected, but it had also revealed their inner strength and the depth of their commitment to family and history. And as the first light of dawn touched the desert horizon, John knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Not in finding the heirloom, but in ensuring that its story and the legacy it represented would continue to be honored for generations to come. The desert morning was calm, the sun rising slowly over the distant hills, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. John Harper, Ayanna, and Nayeli packed up their camp, careful to leave no trace behind. The heirloom rested securely in Ayanna's pack, and though the physical challenges of the canyon had passed, John knew the journey was not yet complete. They still had to ensure the heirloom reached its rightful place, and that the sisters' family could finally feel the closure they had long sought. Their path led back toward the Apache community from which the sisters came. The journey was long, and the terrain, though familiar to John, offered its own subtle tests. Loose stones, narrow paths, and stretches of dry riverbeds demanded constant attention. Yet the sisters walked with renewed confidence, their spirits lifted by the successful recovery of the heirloom. Every so often they paused to point out landmarks and share memories of their family's history, reminding John of the deep connection between people and the land they call home. As they traveled, they encountered a few other travelers and locals who offered greetings and occasional assistance. John noticed the change in the sisters' demeanor, where once they had been cautious and reserved. Now they walked with a quiet pride. The heirloom was not just an object. It represented their family's history, their ancestors' courage, and the strength to overcome loss. It was as if carrying it restored a part of themselves that had been missing for years. Late in the afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the community. Children played near the riverbank, and elders tended to small gardens, their hands skilled from years of work. The air was filled with laughter, conversation, and the scent of earth and wood smoke. Ayanna and Nayeli's pace slowed, and they exchanged glances, both filled with anticipation and a little nervousness. John could sense the weight of the moment. The heirloom would finally return home, completing a journey that had begun decades ago. The sisters were welcomed warmly by family members who had long feared the heirloom was lost forever. Tears were shed, and stories were shared, connecting the past with the present. Ayanna and Nayeli carefully presented the wooden box, explaining how they had found it and the challenges they had overcome. The elders examined it closely, tracing the carved symbols with their fingers, and nodded in quiet approval. The room was filled with a sense of reverence and relief, a feeling that the family's history had finally been restored. John watched the reunion quietly, feeling a mix of pride, humility, and wonder. He had been an outsider in this community, yet he had been entrusted with a mission of profound importance. The sisters' courage, patience, and resilience had inspired him, but he had also played a part in helping them navigate the unknown. It was a reminder that sometimes even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating meaningful change in ways one could never fully predict. In the following days, John spent time with the sisters' family, learning more about their traditions, customs, and history. He listened to stories of ancestors who had shaped the community, of challenges overcome, and of lessons passed down through generations. He realized that the heirloom was more than a box. It was a symbol of identity, memory, and continuity. By returning it, they had not only restored a physical object, but had also reaffirmed the strength of family bonds and cultural heritage. Ayanna and Nayeli's gratitude toward John was evident in countless small ways. They included him in conversations, shared meals with him, and ensured he felt like a part of the community, even if only temporarily. John, in turn, felt a deep connection to the sisters and their family, recognizing that their journey had left a permanent mark on his own life. The quiet strength, determination, and resilience they had displayed were lessons he would carry with him forever. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows over the desert floor, John sat with Ayana and Nayeli outside their family home. They spoke softly about the journey, about what they had learned, and about the future. Ayana smiled, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and satisfaction. "We couldn't have done this without you, John," she said. "You were there when we needed guidance, protection, and support, but more than that, you believed in us when no one else did." John shook his head, feeling modest but proud. "You had the courage all along," he replied. "I just walked alongside you. You carried the mission in your hearts, and that made all the difference." They sat in silence for a while, watching the desert stretch endlessly before them. The sky was a deep blue, and the stars began to emerge, twinkling faintly as the night settled in. John reflected on the journey, from the first night when the sisters arrived at his cabin, seeking shelter from the storm, to this moment of resolution and peace. It had been a journey filled with challenges, discoveries, and growth, and it had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. In the days that followed, John prepared to return to his ranch. The sisters insisted that he stay longer, but he knew he needed to return to the life he had built for himself. Their farewell was quiet but heartfelt. Ayana hugged him tightly, and Nayeli's hand lingered on his shoulder, both gestures filled with gratitude and recognition of the shared journey. As he walked away from the community, John felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The desert around him seemed different now, brighter, warmer, and filled with quiet meaning. He had faced uncertainty, guided the sisters through treacherous terrain, and witnessed the emotional weight of reclaiming a family's legacy. The experience had taught him about the power of trust, the importance of resilience, and the deep impact of human connection. Returning to his ranch, John noticed small things he had never paid much attention to before. The patterns of the clouds, the way the wind moved through the sagebrush, the subtle sounds of wildlife. The desert, which had always been a place of solitude for him, now felt like a living landscape filled with stories, memories, and connections. He realized that life could bring unexpected visitors who leave permanent marks, and that sometimes the most meaningful experiences come from helping others on journeys that extend beyond ourselves. Weeks later, John received a letter from Ayana and Nayeli describing how the heirloom had been safely incorporated into the community's traditions and how it had inspired younger generations to learn about their family history. They thanked him again for his support, kindness, and trust. Reading the letter, John smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey was complete, but its lessons would remain with him forever. John often thought back to that first night when the sisters had arrived at his cabin during the storm. A simple act of kindness had set in motion a series of events that changed the lives of 3 people forever. It reminded him that even small gestures could have profound effects, and that courage, trust, and determination were qualities that could guide anyone through the most challenging moments. In the quiet of his ranch under the vast Arizona sky, John Harper felt a lasting sense of peace. The desert had tested him, the journey had challenged him, and the sisters had inspired him. Their story, their courage, and the heirloom they reclaimed would remain in his heart forever. And he knew deep down that some nights, some journeys, and some encounters have the power to mark a life permanently, leaving lessons and memories that endure long after the moment has passed. As the stars twinkled above, John Harper looked out over the desert, feeling a connection to the world around him and to the people he had met. He understood that life was not only about solitude and routine, but also about the moments when one opens their heart to help, to trust, and to journey with others towards something greater than themselves. The experience had changed him, and he knew that he would carry the lessons of courage, patience, and the importance of family and heritage for the rest of his days. And so the desert remained vast and quiet, but within its endless expanse, the story of John Harper and the two Apache sisters lived on, a story of trust, determination, and the power of reclaiming what was lost.